Welcome to the Never Die Podcast, your weekly crypto alpha for those who never quit. Today we have on Avail to talk about Avail DA, Avail Nexus, Avail Fusion, what it all is, and everything in between. If you aren't familiar with Avail, they're building infrastructure for the modular blockchain world. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay. We talk about what it means in this episode, as well as we dive into Avail DA, which I just mentioned, which will be similar to something like Celestia. It basically allows L2s to have way cheaper transactions because they're posting their data to a different source than Ethereum. So it's a lot cheaper to post their data to something like Avail DA than it would be to post it to Ethereum. They have Avail Nexus, which would be similar to something like the AggLayer, if you're familiar with the AggLayer. It's the idea of like, rather than all these L2s being like their own like lone little islands, they're like united states of chains. Like you can just easily move between these things, cross borders. They're no longer fragmented, but they're like united and easy to move between. That's the idea. It's similar to something like IBC would be another example. That's the idea behind Avail Nexus, but IBC for L2s, etc. And then finally, they have Avail Fusion, which is sort of like AggLayer. So it's quite a bit different than AggLayer, but it's this idea of shared security. So when a new chain launches, they usually got to bootstrap their own validator set, pay out all these token rewards. And instead of doing that, they would tap into this shared security model, making it a lot easier for a layer to bootstrap its validator set. Avail's been a project I've been wanting to interview for a while now. This is going to be a really interesting episode. Let's dive in. Welcome. It's great to have you on the podcast. Maybe just to start, can you explain a little bit about your background and how Avail started, how you got involved in all of that?
Hi, my name is Anurag. I'm co-founder of Avail. So I joined I entered crypto back in 2017. Before that, I've spent about 11 years in fintech, regtech, that sort of product and engineering roles. 2017, I founded Polygon, or Matic Network, which is known back in the day. Built a bunch of stuff there, including the Plasma solution, the Polygon POS solution, the bridging infra, crafted a lot of ZK strategy, eventually acquiring teams like Zero, Hermes, Maiden, and so on. And also actually started Avail within Polygon back in 2020. Up until March 2023, which is last year, Avail was part of Polygon, but we spun it out into its own separate entity. And I also kind of left all operational roles at Polygon to concentrate on Avail full time. And so that's where we are at the moment. So so that's like my rough background, but happy to get into more details.
Maybe can you really simply explain what is Avail?
Yeah, so Avail is essentially infrastructure for the rollup-centric future, right? So what has happened in the world of blockchains is, so blockchains were created or constructed a certain way initially, like from after 2014 or 2008, with Bitcoin and Ethereum releasing into 2014, which was the first general purpose blockchain. What has happened after that is this constant experimentation with new L1s or layer 1 blockchains, so which are kind of variants of Ethereum in the sense that can we do an Ethereum with bigger blocks, or can we make the block times lower, for example? Or can we introduce a new VM? Can we introduce parallelizations? And so that's how blockchains have been constructed. And up until 2019, 2020, before rollups came into the picture, that was what the dominant paradigm was. But after rollups came into the picture, that has changed. Now we are getting into this a different paradigm where it is, rather than doing a monolithic blockchain, you're going modular by, dividing these responsibilities in two different layers. So you have this base layer, which kind of, predominantly Ethereum plays that role today, for example. And then we have these number of rollups on top. It's just now becoming more and more easier to spin up these rollups. because we are now kind of like separated this responsibility of the base layer and the execution layer. So rollups are the execution layer, and the base layers are these specific L1 blockchains that focus on supporting these rollups. So that is Ethereum, but like also like Avail, a blockchain like Avail. So Avail focuses on building this sort of infrastructure that enables or scales rollups. And I firmly believe that we are moving into this future of the rollup-centric future, where all future blockchains will be rollups rather than their own independent L1s, because it's just too much effort of spinning up new L1s. Every time you spin up a new L1, you have to kind of, let's say, bootstrap a validator set, you have to bootstrap crypto economic security, you have to do a token, you have to make that token valuable, you have to like keep that ecosystem sustainable, for example, and so on. So I mean, I think it's just too tough doing this over and over again. And the primary reasons rollups are going to win is because you end up kind of not having to do all this stuff again and again, and you focus on the execution part. And so what Avail really is that it builds infrastructure to support this rollup-centric feature. It builds, first of all, a foundational data availability layer, which provides high throughput for rollup scalability. We also build a component called Avail Nexus on top, which kind of, if once we kind of get into this, enable this world of 1,000 rollups, you also need to ensure that these rollups have good interoperability. And so we build this component called Avail Nexus, which focuses on rollup interoperability. And then we also build something called Fusion, which is additive crypto economic security for the entire ecosystem. So essentially, I mean, to just zoom out, Avail really is infrastructure for this incredible rollup-centric future that we think is the future of blockchains.
Got it. Okay, and maybe I'll explain for the average listener kind of the general bet here. So the idea is like an L1, a generalized L1 is like a jack of all trades. So if you imagine in a company, it's like you're the CEO, you're the web designer, you're the marketing lead, you're the guy making the videos, you're the guy running sales, you do everything. That's a generalized L1. And you're saying, hey, what would work better would be a bunch of specialized things, a bunch of specialized components. So, we should have somebody who's really, really good at sales running sales, and somebody who's really, really good at designing websites, designing the website. This is a very vague comparison, but that's the general idea behind like a modular ecosystem, which is let's break all these components down into their specialized parts and like have the open market kind of compete to be the best part of this stack. And so Avail is building for that kind of world. And so you have 3 products. You have Avail DA, which would be similar to something like Celestia, EigenDA. There's a lot of people are trying to provide this data availability layer for blockchains. It makes it a lot cheaper for blockchains rather than posting to something like Ethereum. It's a lot cheaper to post to something like Avail DA. You have Avail Nexus, which sounds kind of similar to something like the AggLayer. It's a way to connect together a bunch of chains, or maybe like IBC as well, a way to connect together a bunch of chains so that they can work together rather than being like islands. It's like a United States of chains. And then you have Avail Fusion, which that one I don't quite understand as much, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but it sounds maybe kind of similar to EigenLayer-ish. I don't know. I want to get into that, but first I wanted to ask you about Avail Nexus. How similar or different is that, since you're from Polygon, is that to something like Polygon's AggLayer?
Yeah, so I mean, superficially it might, sound similar, and of course the goals are pretty similar, I would say, in general. But so let me kind of try to demarcate the difference. But yeah, I mean, before getting into the exact differences, I just want to kind of dial back a little. And also try to provide like a more easier explanation of or the context in which we view Avail is as the rollup-centric future as, right? In general, like if you kind of look out over how blockchains play a role in technology infra in general. Blockchains are really the culmination of maybe a couple of decades or more effort in, like the platformization of products, as I call it, right? Like, I mean, in general, like in the past, what people used to build products that were built by a company, and then it did a particular, it gave you like a particular product or service, and like that's it, right? Like, but now over the last couple of decades, what we have seen is the rise of platforms or open platforms, such, right? Like, so something like, let's say, the taxi industry being upended by Uber, for example, or like universities being tried to be upended by something like Coursera, for example, or a bunch of other things that work under the premise that you need to have this platform, open platform, where different producers and consumers or can plug in and then exchange services. Either, and this can be economic coordination, social coordination, and so on. And blockchains are this ultimate sort of open coordination infra in that sense. And from this more modular, like not only from an infra perspective, what makes platforms particularly useful is this enabling mixing and matching of different primitives. Like I'll give you an example, right? Like something like Uber, for example. Like when Google released the Android operating system, or Apple with its iOS operating system for mobiles, they didn't come out with something like as advanced as Uber, right? Like they gave these primitives of, let's say, putting the GPS onto mobiles or the camera into the mobile phone, for example. And apps, like developers iterated, tried a lot of different experiments, mixed and matched things, and ultimately came up with something like an Uber, which took the GPS primitive and the mobility primitive and applied it to the passenger driver matching problem. Or Instagram, for example, which took the mobility of the camera and applied it to a more social context. And so essentially, uh, the goal of the platform is to enable different primitives to be mixed and matched in different contexts. And so this modularization really is about, like helping enable these specialized components, which can then kind of be mixed and matched to either replace something which is already being done by a traditional player, or coming up and something entirely new which we didn't even anticipate, right? Like, so that is how we view the overall rollup-centric future and Avail's role in it, of course.
That's a really great way to explain it. So it sounds like it's kind of, I would call it open market dynamics. So it's like you're taking components, or maybe think of them as ingredients, and you're letting the market cook, and you're letting the market come up with their best solutions and figure out ways to innovate using those components, because you're going to get a lot more experimentation, and a lot more experimentation means you're going to get a lot more product market fit and better results over time. The more experimentation you can foster and enable, the better results you ultimately get. And that really is the goal here with kind of this more modular approach.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. That's a really great explanation. Can you go back to Avail Nexus then? And how does that compare to something like the AggLayer? How would you look at those two things?
Yeah. So, I mean, to answer that question, like, let me quickly try to give a rundown on what AggLayer does and what Nexus does, and then, like, it's easier to understand. So, what AggLayer does at the moment is, so you have this Polygon CDK, which is an example of this rollup stack from Polygon, and it does proof aggregation, validity proof aggregation of between Polygon CDK rollups. And then they have this category of what they call pessimistic proofs or invariant proofs, which is basically attestations of, like, the deposits and withdrawals from each chain, which is not the CDK chain, right? Like, it can be Optimism, Arbitrum, Starkware, ZK Sync, and so on, like in general. So the protocol, as I understand it, I mean, I might be off a little bit on the details, but in general, there is this proof aggregation protocol within the CDK ecosystem, and then there is this different lightweight validity proof, which kind of relies on input from these other rollups. And then the AggLayer is really aggregating all these proofs together, right? Like, so that is the definition. Like, that is how the AggLayer is constructed currently. Now, what the Nexus is really, it basically does two things, right? Like, it takes in proofs from any rollup stack. It can be Polygon, zkSync, Starkware, and aggregates all these proofs into a single proof. It basically has this proof of the validity of the rollup in general. And so in an AggLayer, what is happening is this proof that, let's say the zkSync input that they're taking does not incorporate the validity proof of zkSync, for example. It just relies on what the zkSync sequencer is saying that the state of the deposits and withdrawals are. So in a sense that what it does, it allows for quick communication between this, but it has these assumptions that what the sequencer on any non-CDK chain it assumes to be correct, for example. So in that sense, what the Nexus and the AggLayer play are slightly complementary interactions, in the sense that the Nexus proof can actually be flown into the AggLayer, and the AggLayer can then work on the actual validity of other rollups like zkSync, like Starkware, for example, and so on. And so in that sense, it might similar superficially, but it's quite different in that sense. Although, like the goals are kind of the same, that we want to offer some sort of interoperability, but we focus more on asynchronous interoperability, which is like eventual finality or shared notion of validity. I think the focus of AggLayer is more to do with ensuring rollup deposits and withdrawals are quick to coordinate.
Maybe I misunderstood, so I'm going to try to repeat this back, and you tell me if I'm wrong. So I think what you're saying is AggLayer is trying to be like fast movement between chains connected to the AggLayer, and you're more focused on secure and like correct movement between chains. Is that?
So AggLayer certainly has like proof aggregation between the CDK ecosystem, but it also has this additional component of interacting with other chains that come with a certain set of trust assumptions. The Nexus is a fully validity proof driven construction. So, I mean, yes, like if you kind of look at the high level, yes, the AggLayer will be a slightly, it'll focus on being faster for asset deposits between these rollups. We focus on, like asynchronous eventual final interoperability between these chains.
Okay. So yours, like, you would be like top security, like, hey, there's no like, remove all the trust assumptions. We just want you just trust the code. Like, you don't have to trust any people. There's no like very, very crypto ethos, where AggLayer is,
Yep.
Hey, we want to get moving between chains as quick as possible. There are some things you have to trust within the system. And so they're the same, but they're different in that, like, something like the AggLayer could plug into something like Avail Nexus, and Avail Nexus could plug into the AggLayer, and those would be somewhat complementary. It's just different routes. It's like, hey, do you want to take the really fast way to the airport, or do you want to take the really safe way to the airport? And different people will choose different ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I see this working complementarily in the sense that like most users will, like focus, do interactions on the fast layer, and then eventually get finality from the Nexus, for example, right? Like, so, and we work with different players to enable this sort of fast and slow, like security.
So you guys are almost like, I think of like cross-chain intents. Like, if cross-chain intent providers could actually provide a really fast transaction using something like Avail Nexus for the user, maybe it's just like a millisecond. But the people running the intents, they would be waiting for that transaction to actually finalize using
Yeah,
Avail.
absolutely.
Okay, cool. That's cool. I think I get the idea, and I get how this could be complementary or different and kind of their positioning. What is Avail Fusion then? Like, how does that? The closest thing I could think of when you said economic security and kind of the way you talked about it was something like AggLayer, but it also, when I was reading the docs online, it also seems quite a bit different. Can you explain what Avail Fusion is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, see, the motivation behind Fusion is it's again, it's not a separate layer, it's just a component within Avail. The problem with, like when when I was talking about rollups, right? Like the problem with, Avail is a L1 chain, new L1 chain. And the problem with new L1 chains is that you have to bootstrap the cryptographic security. You have to, so of course, like when we launch on mainnet, we will launch with only the Avail native token, which most L1 blockchains start with. But like the L1 token or the cryptographic security that you derive from the L1 token necessarily, like takes time to reach a point where, like you have enough cryptographic security. And so every L1 blockchain goes through that phase. And so what we thought was, can we kind of accelerate that process of getting more cryptographic security by leveraging existing non-native tokens, right? Like, so of course you can stake with the Avail token, and there will be a value associated with the Avail token, which will give the cryptographic security that is required. But can we also allow people to stake things like ETH and BTC and other tokens, for example, so that we can increase the cryptographic stake or attached to the base layer. And so from a comparison point of view, I would say you can liken this to more like EigenLayer comes more from a supply side point of view, where like they accumulate all these restaked ETH, for example, to supply to other systems. For example, we can think us more as a consumer, in the sense that, like we take in services from, like, let's say Babylon for BTC, for example, and other protocols for ETH and other tokens, for example. And the idea is you just do the staking once on the Avail base layer, and any rollup on top of Avail benefits from this shared security. They don't need to kind of subscribe to a subset of security or something. Like whatever the security of the Avail base layer is, all the rollups on top inherit this shared security.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is where EigenLayer is taking ETH security and you're restaking, you're reusing that same validator to secure something else. You guys are creating your own network, your own security network of validators, essentially, where anyone could use any token maybe to stake in, so like Bitcoin, ETH, etc., Avail, to secure their validator. But you're not like you're not restaking ETH validators. You're using Avail validators, and it's just whatever can be slashed in that validator could be something besides Avail. It could be ETH, Bitcoin, etc. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, see, like when we talk about restaking, I mean, I think we also have to update a lot of notions in general, right? Like, so of course, I think EigenLayer started off with something like restaked ETH, for example, but it also supports native ETH, for example. Now, Babylon is now bringing BTC to the table, for example. And so essentially, what we are kind of saying is using that the ETH or non Avail native token assets to contribute to add more cryptographic security to the Avail base layer. That's our intent, and we want to improve on the UX experience of developers who want to spin up new chains. They don't have to deal with the underlying complexity of like paying for X number of security. They just kind of create a rollup, and all rollups share the security of the base layer. So it's a better developer experience in that sense.
Okay, this reminds me, I mean, EigenLayer also reminded me of this. So way back in the day, Cosmos had like a shared security proposal where like the Cosmos Hub would use Atom, and like other chains launching Cosmos could like use that shared security to like bootstrap their validator set when they're getting started. And your guys are essentially doing something like that in the Avail network, where it's like, hey, any chain that launches can bootstrap using the Avail shared security. It's an alternative to something like if somebody wanted to tap into AggLayer, it is different, but it's also maybe more dynamic in that it's just it's a different approach. And so you're saying to the market, hey, here's a different offering. If you want to use this, we're something different.
Yeah, I mean, this is not really like a new approach in that sense. Like when you build a rollup on Ethereum, the rollup inherits the security of like the Ethereum base layer. Like in general, like rollups are the construct to kind of borrow security of the base layer. Like that's the function of how a rollup works, and that's why that's why I said earlier in the discussion that Avail is really infrastructure for the rollup-centric future, right? When you build infra on Avail, those rollups inherit the entire security of the Avail base layers. And what we believe is in the future, there will be only 2 or 3 of these base layers, and all the rest will be rollups on top, right? Like, and so that's the reason why we want to ensure that we have good cryptographic security.
Okay, I think the whole picture is coming together here. So rollup-centric future, you talked about that a bunch, and like that's what we're built for. That's what we're built for. And so rollups can come to you. They can say, hey, we want alternate DA. We want cheaper costs. They can tap into Avail DA. They're like, hey, we want to be able to connect to other chains. They can tap into Avail Nexus. They're like, hey, we need to bootstrap our validator set. They can tap into Avail Fusion. So these are all products for rollups in this rollup-centric future. And it sounds like you guys don't have like, there's no main chain for Avail. It's like in the same way that, you have Solana, Ethereum, etc. There's no like chain to build apps on. You guys are just the infrastructure between chains. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, just to correct one thing from the last statement that you made, like with Fusion, we don't help in, you can, but like essentially it's for like with Avail native token staking, let's say we reach, let's say $5 billion in stake, for example, right? Like, I mean, so that's the cryptographic security on which the Avail base chain is there. Now, if we enable BTC and ETH staking, we can increase that to 10 million, for example, like in cryptographic security, for example. And that entire cryptographic security is can be used to kind of secure for any rollup to inherit that shared security, right? Like so ETH derives its entire cryptographic security from only ETH. Avail does slightly some different. It also uses the Avail native token, but also uses something like ETH and BTC, for example. So, and this is staked with the validators that Avail uses. So slight modification there. Sorry, what was your next question?
Just that you guys don't have a chain. It's not like ZK Sync,
Yeah. So this is what I'm kind of referring to. Like up until 2020, the way that blockchains were constructed was this, like this new kind of L1s that you used to have to bootstrap every single time, right? Like, I mean, if you wanted to do a new rollup with a new execution, like a VM, for example, or some newer stuff, you have to tweak this L1 or create a new L1, and you have to bootstrap a validator set. You have to bootstrap, like this cryptographic security, the token, for example. And I think that is not going to happen. I mean, you can just look at the graveyard of L1s out there, for example, which don't have enough cryptographic security. And so I believe that, like, rollups will be how future blockchains will be constructed. Now, rollups need not be just EVM rollups, although they are the more dominant rollups that you can see out there. Rollups can be anything. Like rollups are just simple verifiable state machines. They can be as simple as a few lines of TypeScript or Rust code which can be verified, right? Like, and you will see a lot of these simpler stacks in production very soon. Different kind of rollup stacks in production very soon. Like you already have something like Starkware's Cairo VMs in production. There's a lot of Move VMs rollups coming into production. You have like team like Stacker doing a TypeScript based rollup stack, for example, and so on. So because these rollups or L2s are really just, like I said, like I like to say, these are just fancy L1 apps. They do a bunch of things off chain, but they send in the basic minimum required to for the L1 to kind of verify whether, or from other users to verify whether something was done correctly or not, for example. And in that sense, they're just an extension of the base layer, whether it be Ethereum or Avail. And so what you're going to like the rollups on top of Avail are as much as a part of Avail as the rollups are. Like in general, like the rollups on Ethereum are an extension of Ethereum. Rollups on Avail are an extension of Avail, for example, and so on. So we don't really build any smart contracts. We focus on infra that supports the development of these rollups. So we help with scaling rollups. We help with like ensuring these rollups talk to each other and they are secure.
Are you guys like ecosystem focused? Like like Polygon as a whole is like focused on the ETH ecosystem. Are you guys pretty agnostic? Like are you talking about like Solana rollups, Bitcoin rollups, Ethereum rollups, or how do you guys fit into that?
At the moment, like we are, like quite focused on the rollup ecosystem in Ethereum because that's the only ecosystem where rollups are dominant at the moment, right? Like, and that's where we are seeing all the action. Because we build for rollups, like we go wherever the rollups are, right? Like those are primarily in the Ethereum ecosystem. So we work with Polygon, Arbitrum, Optimism, Starkware, ZK Sync, Scroll, Stacker Labs, Sovereign Labs, like the whole host of rollup stacks that are there. And but really it's up to the rollup stack, right? Like, so right now we kind of come in, like our initial GTM is to work with rollups to help them with inexpensive, like data availability, for example, to start with, right? Like, but like if you kind of look at the Ethereum ecosystem in general, what has happened over period is that there are all these different rollup stacks that have been developed and they have developed very differently, right? Like, and so the interfaces are different, the proving systems are different, and so you also have this sort of silo in the ecosystems. Like Optimism has a super chain, Arbitrum has this Orbit ecosystem, Polygon has this AggLayer, or ZK Sync has a hyperchain ecosystem, Starkware has the L3 fractal ecosystem, and so like these are 5 different ecosystems, like not one single unified ecosystem. And so of course we kind of help these rollups to like with inexpensive data availability to start with, but because we like build this foundational data availability layer with data availability sampling, it's possible for us to kind of help these talk to each other, or like as we say, unify them together, for example, to eventually arrive at like something like chain abstraction in that sense, to move closer to a more unified Ethereum sort of a positioning.
How fast? So you mentioned that it's more secure but a little bit slower. How fast does it take to move between rollups using something like Avail Nexus?
So I answer this in 2 parts, right? Like, so we kind of employ this fast and slow sort of methods, right? Like, so there is this fast methodology where we work with like shared sequencer players like Radius and Espresso, for example, and so on, to do almost real-time composability. Like, like there the assumption is how fast the sequences of the rollups are. So that's where we focus on for more better UX experience, right? Like, and there we partner up with shared sequencer players to enable that. That is initial, like pre-confirmations, like or asynchronous bridging, which is very fast, like can be as low as milliseconds or whatever time the sequencer takes to kind of process the transaction. Then the nexus at the backend eventually kind of, and all these transactions get sent to the nexus, for example, or the proofs. And then you have some sort of eventual cryptographic finality. That is predicated on the time it takes for each rollup to generate the proof. So that might be slightly different for each rollup. Like GK has a certain proof generation time, ZK Sync has a certain proof generation time, Starkware has a certain proof generation time, and so on. And so essentially, eventually, like it depends on the time taken for the proof generation for the particular rollup. So, so there's a fast layer with the shared sequencer stuff, and then there's a slow but more secure layer. So from a user experience level, we don't let this percolate to the user in that sense. The user is always interacting with the more faster bit, and this is more like a backend infrastructure for the shared sequencer to tap into.
Got it. That makes sense. So there's a faster and how fast would you say that? Just like a guess, fast would you say the user experience could get using that faster layer?
So we've been working a bunch with like this sequencer project called Radius. They're a fantastic team, and they have like this sequencer infra which like runs in millisecond latencies, for example. But ultimately, it's up to the rollup stack, right? Like, I mean, if something like most rollup stacks, if you see, are somewhere in the range of, like 250 milliseconds for Arbitrum to maybe a couple of seconds for other sequences, for example. And so if you want to do, let's say, like send funds from one rollup to the other, these are essentially two transactions. Like, you burn the asset here, mint it here. And so it will take the form of like a bundle transaction where user signs a transaction, a mint transaction, burn transaction here, a mint transaction here, and it gets handled probably, if it's a shared sequencer, it can be done in one block. If it's if transactions are routed on separate sequences, it might take 2 blocks. So give or take like a few seconds.
Okay. And kind of switching subjects. I know you guys have a token, the Avail token. How does that fit into the picture? What's the Avail token used for in the ecosystem besides, you mentioned Avail Fusion, it's used for that shared security. Does it have any other role it plays within the ecosystem?
Yeah, for sure. So certainly the Avail native token is used for staking, for cryptographic security, but it also used as for fees that are paid by rollup sequencers for, let's say data availability and so on. On the Nexus side, the token is used for, like people to stake so that they can become, like bridging relayers, proof aggregators, sequencers, and so on. And so you can actually stake the Avail token to play one of those roles. You also get bridging fees back if you kind of facilitate, like rollup interop between rollups. And so the bridging fees accrue to the token, for example, and they are done in the Avail token. So we have kind of thought a lot about how the token accrues value in the entire ecosystem. So it plays a role on the data availability part. It also plays a role on the Nexus part. Also, it plays a role on the Fusion side. So, so the token has a role to play in all three major components.
Got it. Okay. And then my last question is: fast forward like 3 to 5 years. Where would you hope Avail would be? Like, kind of paint a picture for us of like the long-term vision of like where you hope Avail kind of finds itself in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before as well, right? Like, I mean, from 2019, 2020, like especially Ethereum has moved to what is called the rollup-centric future. And I kind of try to lay down why rollups are going to be the future of blockchains, because it's just much easier to spin up rollups in general. It's much easier to do experiments, for example, on different sort of execution VMs, for example, different ways to transact and so on in general. Like just take like if you kind of take a look at Base, for example, right? Like, so Base just took what the Optimism team had built, the OP stack, and then spun up a new chain without doing any of the validator bootstrapping that they would have to do, or doing a token, for example. They just focused on what was important to them, which is like things like user acquisition and adoption and so on, for example. And they've been pretty successful. And so you can see that the launch of new rollups has been steadily increasing. Like we already have probably 200, 300 rollups on production, and many more coming in the future. And so I think we believe that rollups are certainly going to be the future of how blockchains are constructed. And so we think that blockchain architecture will move to a paradigm where there will be a few base layers or L1s and there will be tens and thousands of rollups on top. And these few L1s will be infrastructure to support the rollups on top. And like they won't necessarily have smart contracts or execution infra there, right? Like all the execution is offloaded to the rollups, for example. Even on Ethereum, like Ethereum historically began as a very execution focused blockchain, but the roadmap that it is on is looking at a very different reality. The roadmap it is on there's no major change to the execution environment that will happen. Most of the computation capacity will be used to verify rollups, like rollup proofs and things like that, and not for general user transactions. And so you will see that the major base layers will be those layers which focus on providing rollup specific functionality, not smart contract specific functionality. So I believe that we will see that the blockchain world converging into this, and I hope, of course I'm biased, but I want Avail to be one of those base layers.
That's a great answer. Is there anything, just because I'm not as familiar with Avail as obviously you are, is there anything that I should have asked or that I missed that I didn't, that should be talked about when it comes to Avail?
Yeah, I think in general, I would say mostly you covered a lot of the stuff that is out there. But in general, I'm not sure, but I see a lot of people still not understanding the rollup construct, in the sense that why is it important? Why people are so bullish on this? Why this will upend the way how blockchains are constructed? Because people still focus on new L1s, for example, and so on. But this is really going to change how future blockchains are constructed, and in general, it's just much faster to come up with these more modular pieces of functionality that, as I mentioned before, we can mix and match to arrive at really interesting use cases. So I think that's really the crux that I wanted to kind of convey.
That makes sense, and I agree with that. A field for experimentation and open up the playing field for experimentation yields results that I think most people have a hard time understanding. But I think maybe the easiest understanding point would be like pre the App Store. If you looked at phones, they came in with built-in apps. And so you had the phone manufacturer would say, hey, here's the apps we think that users will like, and we're going to put those on the phone. And then as soon as the phone opened it up and said, Apple opened it up and said, hey, we're going to let anyone build any app that they can on this phone. They can use the camera. All kinds of crazy ideas started popping up. People started using the flash as a flashlight. Like all kinds of crazy stuff. And you would never had that. You'd have never found those ideas had you not opened up the iPhone to be experimented on by these app developers. And it's that same kind of broad concept, but for blockchains and the infrastructure around blockchains. And it's going to yield results that you can't imagine, and no one team could have come up with, because that's how the open market works.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, just quick disclosures. I did get the Avail airdrop. I'm not sure how much it is off the top of my head, but I did get the Avail airdrop. As always, none of this is investment advice. None of this is us telling you to buy anything or anything like that. Purely educational. You should always do your own research. It has been great having you. It's been great talking about Avail, and excited to see what you guys cook up over 2024 and 2025.
Yep. Thanks for having me.